Does a good man exist? My wife came home from work one day. She and her friends had been talking, having a wonderful conversation, it sounded like. And one of them asked the question, does a good man even exist? So now this is an entire group of women, and they're completely silent. Of course, my wife comes home. She relays this entire story to me. And I'm like, hello. I'm right here. But joking aside, it did lead to a very good conversation. And we quickly dove down to what defines a good man. We had to start there, right? And we came to a good man is an ally to women. And that's all women. No more of this, what if it was your sister, what if it was your mother situation. A good man is an ally to all women. So, thank you. We took that definition, or I took that definition, and then I put it up against my culture. And I quickly saw, culturally, this is a challenge. I couldn't help but wonder, why is that? So first, let's talk about my culture. I grew up in far southwestern Virginia, where Virginia meets Kentucky. All of the men in my family are surface coal miners. They either operate or work on heavy machinery every day. So, thinking about that and all of those men, I remember sitting at Mama and Papa's kitchen table Sunday afternoons. All of these men, my uncles, my grandfather, Papa, and my father, and they're having all these different conversations about new mines that are opening up, what machine they're driving or working on this week, or they're talking about the NASCAR race that's on the television. They're talking about the hunting trip or fishing trip they got coming up this weekend. And growing up in this environment, I could probably tell you every piece of equipment Caterpillar makes because they've all driven or worked on it. But sitting there as a young boy, I grew up in this culture where there were 3 safe conversations. You could talk about work, you could talk about hunting and fishing, or you could talk about sports. So, realizing that, I wonder why. Why are those the only safe topics? I quickly came to, we got to look at how we perceive our own masculinity. What does that look like? The men that sat around that table held closely to the traditional male masculine values. They viewed their masculinity as being everything that is not feminine. So the definition of our own masculinity was making sure that we were not feminine. Now, that creates a lot of problems in and of itself, but when I think about it, I can't help but wonder, are we leaving half of ourselves on the table because we are scared of our own femininity? There's a fascinating study by Jennifer Boson where she takes a group of men and she makes sure that they understand that they are going to be videoed doing certain tasks, and they're just going to move through all these different rooms doing these different tasks. But she made sure that they knew they were going to be videoed and a lot of people would see this video. These men were asked to do all these different tasks, one of those tasks being braiding a doll's hair. And then they moved to the next room and there's a punching bag. And between 60 and 70% of the men who braided the doll's hair punched the punching bag. Her conclusion was men who felt publicly emasculated often reacted in anger because they felt like they had lost their masculinity. Their masculinity was something that took their entire life to gain, and they could lose it in one moment. I have some personal stories around that, but one that came to mind was, as I got older, having rejected all of the femininity within myself, I started to crave some of those deeper conversations. I got tired of just talking about work. I got tired of just talking about sports and hunting and fishing. And so I remember trying to push my father one time. And I asked him a lot of different probing questions, but one of those questions was, what are you afraid of? And his answer was, nothing. Now, I know that's not true. But I also know that my father wasn't ready for that question. My father had been raised in the same culture that I had been raised in, and I asked too much of him at that time. But it was hard for me to hear that. And it was hard for me to crave that conversation and not get it. So I ask, being where we are now, where do we go from here? We see what the problem is. It's pretty obvious. But I tried to push my dad, and he didn't want to go there. So what do we do? In my opinion, I think we have to start small. We have to start with a couple of people that we feel comfortable with, a close friend. My father, I've got to go back to it, but we have to start small and make sure that the people that we are having these conversations with feel safe. We have to make sure that we make them feel comfortable, and we have to make sure that we feel comfortable, and we have to take those baby steps. And we've got to start having those conversations. Because if we're constantly rejecting our own femininity, how could we ever become allies for women? And then, how could we ever become good men? So, if we start small, and we have some of those tough conversations, slowly, with our close friends, with some of our family members, if I can start with my dad and make him feel comfortable around me, and make sure that he knows that when he's with me, it's a safe place. And he can tell me some of those things where he feels vulnerable, where he feels scared. Then my hope would be that he can go and have that conversation with his friends. And he can start with his small group. And then it propagates. And then before you know it, we've got an entire Appalachia of men who are healthy and who are allies for women. So that we've created a safe space not only for our men, but all of the people within our own community. What's at stake if we don't? What's at stake if I can't call my father on the phone and start having those conversations? Well, first, I'm probably going to lose my shot at being a good man. But secondly, there's an entire generation of young men who are coming up behind us. And they're already starting to take the damage that we've taken. And they're young. And they don't understand. So we've got to take those first steps to make sure that that doesn't happen. We've got to take those first steps to make sure that those young men can become the allies for women that they need to be and become an entire generation of good men. Now, does a good man exist? I can't answer that question. But I'm doing everything I can to become one. Thank you.